Morning, everybody. Today, the UK is still part of the EU, and we have our second day of the IMPAKT Festival. So, very welcome. Today is called Sensory Empowerment, and it will be a very full program with 2 panels, a keynote, an interactive performance, interactive installation, and 2 video screenings. And we will look at how technology and the digital interface connects to our biological beings, and how it is finding how our neurosensory systems are working by more and more sensitive interfaces and sensors. And we try to find parallels between the different sciences, but also asking designers and artists how they deal with this matter. Later today, Dr. Mavi Sanchez-Vivas will tell us all about maybe something which is quite new to you, a phenomenon called virtual body ownership. It talks about how we make a mental model of ourselves and the world in our brains, and this is actually how we function in our daily lives, but also tells us why we experience virtual reality as reality, so something really real. So this is later, and in the panel, Mark Farid will tell about his upcoming experiment. He will be put in a virtual environment for 14 days non-stop in the body of someone else. So it's kind of a virtual reality astronaut. So this is, I think, super exciting. So you should all come to the panel and later to Mavi Sanchez-Vivas' keynote. And we'll finish the day with a beautiful performance by Marianne Maruyama. And she stated, privacy is a lonely word. So maybe we should reconsider our relationship with privacy and our intimacy with privacy, but maybe it's something we already lost. So please come for that tonight. The first panel, we have 3 guests who are in their own field exploring how sentient experience is produced in the body and the brain, and how it becomes within our reach with these new interfaces and sensors. We'll experience substitutions for failing senses, and we will investigate how our body is being tracked and trained, and how maybe this is maybe they are disciplined for like capitalist structures. So let's think about how these sentiences are part of like a normalization of how we're supposed to behave. Then we will look at brain interfaces, science, like how the brain can be activated for prosthesis, for example, like a speech computer. Will these developments make society more inclusive, or maybe we're creating more tools for civil security and mind manipulation? I want to finish this introduction with a short statement of Andy Clark. Andy Clark is a neurophilosopher, and he rejects the idea of a person is complete in himself, shut against the outside, in no need of help. How is it that human thought is so deeply different from that of other animals, even though our brains can be quite similar? The difference is due, he believes, to our heightened ability to incorporate props and tools into our thinking, to use them to think thoughts we could have never have otherwise. If we do not see this, he writes, it is only because we are in the grip of a prejudice, that whatever matters about my mind must depend solely on what goes on inside my own biological skin bag, inside my ancient fortress of skin and skull. It's time to introduce our moderator, Paulien Dresscher. Paulien is working as an independent curator and researcher in the field of culture and digital media, and the crossroads of theory and practice. Currently, she creates the interactive program of the Nederlands Film Festival and the art program of Into the Great Wide Open, of public spaces. Next to this, she is teaching media philosophy and spaces and screens at Utrecht University and is working as a researcher in the context of creative economy theme of the Fontys University of Applied Sciences in Eindhoven. And she's part of the advisory board of the Dutch Literature Fund. Paulien, welcome.
Well, thank you, Jan, for this beautiful and interesting introduction of the whole day. I think we are already a little bit late, and we will start immediately with the introduction of our first speaker. That will be Simon Dogger, Sense Whisperer. During his study at the Design Academy Eindhoven, he lost his sight and was forced to take a long break. He returned as a non-visual designer with a renewed ability to listen and feel and a strong drive to regain his independence, not seeing himself as handicapped, but as someone who takes in information differently. He set out to explore more inclusive forms of communication. His concepts and designs combine visual, auditory, and sensory means to improve the quality of life, not only for the visual impaired, but for all people who could benefit from self-empowering, intuitive tools that help them connect with others and their surroundings. Simon, please join us on stage. A little side note, I think you all found this on your chair. Just keep it near, because we are going to use this very soon, and Simon will be introducing us how we are going to use this during his talk. Simon, are you ready for us?
I'm fully ready.
Okay. Well, good luck and enjoy, everyone. Simon Dogger.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased you're all here. So, splendid introduction by Paulien. I'd like to just join that. And just to start off, my name is Simon Dogger. I am a designer. I work in the fields of developing products and spaces to have a multi-sensory editory. So, and you have all found masks on your seating. To say that my work is hugely inspired by my lack of being able to see. So that inspired, it influenced. And I think it is also for you interesting to find out where I am behaving myself and how do I behave. So I'd like you to wear these masks, and I'm not sure if the following speakers will like that, but preferably you'll keep them on the whole session. But the following speakers have to agree with that. So I hope everybody found their mask. And like I said, I work to look at spaces and products from a multi-sensory view. I became blind in 2009. I resumed my education in 2014. I graduated in 2017. And I have to say that I am hugely inspired by my loss. And that loss would be that I'm not able to gain access to body language or emotion, or another loss is the loss of independence. And I realized that as soon as I treated that loss as a design project, it changed. And mainly it changed into a desire. Because at a certain point I was able to look at that loss from an objective point of view. I could do objective research of what that loss was, how it behaved, how I anticipated on that loss. And I was able to reflect and have an analysis upon these results, and then treat that, to think about it, perhaps to implement it. And I was educated in taking up these tools, using these tools in order to create a different outcome. Now, I will slightly tip off one project before I turn to the main project I will tell about, which is the Emotion Whisperer. And now I am, in cooperation with the Van Abbe Museum Eindhoven, looking at their space, at their public space. And a public space is always built and designed from an architectonic point of view, which is always from a visual point of view. And that way of designing the space is, the effect of that is that it's simply not possible for blind people to actually independent access the building. And talking about a museum, you know, going to a museum, you can go with somebody else, but that is not actually taking care of a quality visit. You know, it's nice to go with somebody else. So we are thinking about redesigning their museum, and which is going in 2 parts or 3 parts. With the first part is to think about navigating through the space. And for that, a concept of mine is being implemented, which is a navigation tool, an application. And it works kind of like the TomTom, but then indoors and for blind people. And the second part is to have access to the arts, and for that reason, all the visual content, so the paintings, the objects which you're not able to touch, are translated into sound, feeling, and smell. And then the final part is that we are redesigning spaces in temperature, in feeling, in sound, and just to have the experience of a space solemnly being designed for another perception, a multi-sensory perception. Now, I was asked here to come to talk about the Emotion Whisperer. That's another project. And the Emotion Whisperer is translating the emotions of conversation partners into a vibration. And it works by a pair of glasses with an integrated camera that streams the imaging of a conversation partner to a smartphone. And that smartphone is able to recognize the emotions and send that data to a wearable, which is either a stone or a bracelet. Now we are developing with the University of Amsterdam a tool that is avoiding the fact that software is able to give the interpretation, because then you can ask, how am I able to trust that interpretation? So the University of Amsterdam is actually now doing the research part. They're doing a validation research. If you're able to learn these vibrations through the skin and where these vibrations can take place and in which form. But the other part is that we are now looking at is that avoiding the software to tell the interpretation of an emotion. And previously, we had the interpretation saying which emotion it was. And now we are working that we have a system that the software tells us which muscles behave. So you have roughly 30 muscles in your face. And all of these 30 muscles, they represent an emotion. And if you have, for instance, emotion 1, 3, and 9, that would mean anger. If you have the emotions 1 and 3, that would mean slight anger. And now we are looking at the wearable to take the form of these 30 specified units of information. So for muscle 1, 3, and 9, you will feel on your skin a vibration that you know, okay, that is muscle 1, 3, and 9. And in that way, we actually reach a final outcome at an earlier stage. We think that it will take approximately 2 to 3 years to finalize a product that has been validated. So, are you able to learn it? Are you willing enough to charge it? Are you willing enough to take it with you? But mainly, if that product is able to give you a higher quality of life in usage. I actually like to just do some research. I'm not sure if I'm able to use the word research, but for me, I don't know how many people are here, so maybe you can have a click. So that's quite a lot. And just for my own sake, who's a man? Who is a woman? Who is neither a man nor a woman? Who doesn't feel man nor woman? Okay, interesting. Age 0 to 10? 10 to 20? 20 to 30? 30 to 40? 40 to 50? 50 to 60? 70 to 80? In the creative industry? Way a lot. I'm not sure. I'm not going to tell that. Yeah. The interesting thing about the emotion whisper is concerning the sensory substitution. And that is basically what we are doing is that the eyes don't work. So we need to divert that information through another sense. So we're kind of trading senses. Eyes don't work, we need to get the skin. We found out that to do that is difficult. Skin doesn't work the same way. For the Van Abbe Museum, we are now developing the tool, the navigation tool, and we try to make blind people follow a virtual guideline, but we also try to make people have let's say, an intuitive way of following that line. And we find out is the way vibrations can offer that is very limited. And we also think this is somewhat of a sensory substitution. And the interesting thing about the emotion whisper is the quality of the software. So just to explain you very short, because I believe I have 3 minutes left, there are two types of emotions. One is rational, which has about the time of 0.5 seconds, and it's rational, so you can think about it. But there is another emotion which is really fast, which is spontaneous, and that happens just so fast that you're not able to see that. So, just my question, what happens if that software will be developed to such a quality level that it is also able to recognize these spontaneous emotions? Namely, that would mean that you will be able to know if somebody is not true, lying, for instance. And just to have a test, who thinks that is, we shouldn't go there? And click. Okay, maybe can somebody specify that? Who clicked? Yeah, please? Okay, so other test results. Who, looking forward to further the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Simon. We have a few minutes to, to have a short conversation. I'm looking at the first row. Do we have 2-3 minutes? Because we're a little running late. We started so late. But thanks for this interesting talk. I just realized when you started asking us these questions that you did not know all those things. And maybe we should have told you where you are and who is in the audience. And maybe we should have told you that your name is behind us, super big, in a very yellow screen. I mean,
I didn't know.
I have glitters on my shoes, and I'm very, very tall, and I wished I was thinner. You know, there are so many things that I know when I look around, so much more than just emotional expressions that give me information about where I am, if I'm safe or not. Are there other things for you as a designer, besides facial expressions, you are actually lacking in daily life, you would like to develop tools for?
Sure, yeah. But I told you independence, emotion, body language. There must be more. So I used to be very fond of looking at old pictures, like ancient pictures. And that's something I'm not able to do. I like to know art. I like to have a quality understanding of art. And some of the things I'm working already with, but you know, there's always within that translation, it's never a one-on-one translation. Mm-hmm. So actually what you were saying, that you wear glitter shoes and you were not as thin as you wanted, mm-hmm. which I remember.
I'm one of those over 50s, and then your body is changing and then you start to try to hide it, etc.
It's kind of interesting in that perspective, because I didn't know you were...
My phone is ringing, sorry.
Okay. So I wasn't able to see that. And you could say, okay, then you won't judge anyone. But that's not true, because I do judge people, but on different forms of information.
That's interesting.
Because I listen to voice and the way they talk, and the speed and the volume, also what they say. I kind of know as well in a conversation which direction they are speaking towards me, so their body position. Actually, I'm looking at you right now, mm-hmm. so which I don't really need to do. But
I admit I took off my glasses, so I know this. I'm cheating here.
No, but different. I'm not sure if I am only capable of doing that, but I'm quite good at finding out more or the deeper layer of somebody, of his opinion or
I think this is a very interesting point to continue talking about later in the panel at the end. One last question. Are there more designers like you who are working on these kind of tools, being blind themselves, or are you a one-man army?
I'm a one-man army.
Okay.
No, not really. Like there's a, like I think the field of in the creative sector have shifted for the past 15 years, and that means there is another direction they're heading towards, and mainly that is directed to more social matters. And we have the environment, we have all these global issues that needs to be addressed. And in that field, there's a lot of activity going on for inclusive design. And so there are many people designing things for blind people. And it's getting better. I think previously 9 out of 10 people came to me had something that I couldn't understand what benefit it would do. So they would just have an assumption and make something for that. And I think that's shifting. So
Yeah.
designers are way more developing tools and products that are actually beneficiary.
Good. I think this is a good moment to leave it for now. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Someone will help you to get back to the front row. And thank you again very much. Then our next speaker is Chris Salter, Sense Factory. Chris Salter is an artist, professor of computational arts at Concordia University in Montreal, and co-director of the Hexagram Network for Research Creation in Media Arts, Design Technology, and Digital Culture. Salter's performances, installations, research, and publications have been presented at numerous festivals, exhibitions, and conferences around the world. He is the author of Entangled in 2010, An Alien Agency 2015, both published by MIT Press. He was creative consultant for the Barbican Centre in London, and his new book, called Self-Censored, on machine and human sensing, will appear from MIT as well next year. Chris, welcome. Are you ready?
Yeah.
We are as well.
Thank you.
Go ahead, floor is yours.
Thank you, Paulien. Did anyone see the performance last night that we did? Okay, so yeah, there we go. I can also hear you much better than I can see you. So I talk a little bit about that. So in 1865, Frans Donders, who was here in Utrecht, ran a series of experiments to try to calculate what he called the speed of thought itself, which is interesting. And he was one of the first scientists to actually, they claimed that that date in 1865 was the beginning of experimental psychology. He was one of the first scientists to actually claim or to attempt to measure essentially cognitive processes, to quantify the duration of those processes. Now, of course, he couldn't look into the brain, so the way he did that was what was called reaction time. So essentially, he would ask subjects to discriminate between, for instance, two different sounds, and as you discriminated, you would increase what was called the reaction time, the time between a stimulus and your action, your response to that stimulus. And so he said, and then what he did is by subtracting the time that it took to perform the task from the time it took to do a more complex task, he could precisely isolate the duration of a mental process, basically discrimination, for instance. So this is very interesting. Now, what does this have to do with now? According to a friend of mine who's a very interesting historian of science, Henning Schmidgen in Germany, he said that Donder's research was part of a larger movement in the sciences at the end of the mid-19th century to move away from a focus on space and toward a focus on time. And Schmidtgen says that basically there's a new kind of physiological time, the time of one's body, that emerged during this period of experimentation on human subjects as well as animals to try to understand their temporal actions and reactions. Now, what was interesting about that movement was part of that movement was designed also around the fact that measurement was beginning to become an important factor in science. This is actually the device that Donders used, which is an early phonautograph, an early gramophone, which he would speak into. Then it had a tuning fork that could measure essentially the duration of the experiment. And then the tuning fork is there at the top, and then at the bottom you see one you see the action, and then you see the stimulus, and then you see the response to that. And one person and another person. So they try to measure the distance between the action and the stimulus. So, but at this time also this interest in sensing started to emerge, and the ability to measure human responses. And these three scientists, Helmholtz on the left, Wilhelm Wundt, who was the inventor of experimental psychology, in the middle, and Etienne Jumeret, who was a French physiologist and also the developer, the inventor of chronophotography, were part of that movement. And what's very interesting is they were all obsessed with what was called the la méthode graphique, the graphic method. And what they wanted to do was to use these measuring devices to understand the physiology of their subjects and then transmit that into essentially curves and lines. In fact, temporal forms that were inscribed onto rotating drums and so on. So they were very fascinated by saying that, of course, we can't trust the human senses. We need instruments and we need technologies to actually render those senses into readable form. So it goes back again to this idea that your experience is deceptive, so you need to actually translate that into written equivalents. This, for instance, is the kymograph, literally a wave writer. It measured the change of blood flow, and you can see essentially that drum is where essentially this kind of line of your blood flow would be drawn. Now, what's really interesting is that was the 19th century, but guess what? It still is there. So if we look at contemporary sensor technologies around the wellness industries, if you probably don't know this, are essentially worth almost $4.2 trillion at the moment. And there are dozens of commercially available tracking devices, from rings to eyeglasses to you name it, jewelry with names like Feel and Spire and UpMood, Moodbeam, Empatica, PIP, or Beyond Verbal. This is a few of the devices that are now being sold by startups. And now all these trackers are the latest attempt to electrochronically capture that which remains very elusive to us, which is our feelings. Go back to this idea of motion. So for instance, this is a sensor called Feel. Now what's interesting is read the rhetoric here. Feel is a wrist-based emotion sensor and mental health advisor whose manufacturer, a company called Sentio Solutions, and Sentio in Latin is essentially to perceive with the senses, which is ironic, advertises its product with the language of a therapist, right? So this device basically, quote, senses emotions throughout the day using a proprietary emotion recognition technology. All of them are proprietary, of course, and also gives real-time evidence-based support and 24/7, right? So now I'll show you something in a second that shows you the difference between that and actually talking to a psychotherapist. Now here's another device called the Moodbeam. This is nice. This lets change the way the world sees mood. That's funny, it sees mood as opposed to feel it. The first wearable device that logs how we feel at the push of a button. Now, this is interesting because the quotation from the startup that started this device is, quote, "The accessory was created with the ambition to transform the way the world sees mood," right, making it easier to understand and talk about. But Moodbeam is not just positioned as a wearable technology, it also is actually branded as a movement. There's a whole movement of people wearing this device. So if you push one button, you may feel happy, and if you push another button, you can indicate that you feel sad. Okay, so despite the differences in the names, the thing about all these technologies is that they're actually the proprietary emotion technologies. Anybody know what that might be? How do you measure your emotions? Anybody know? What? No, so it's close, but it's done with of course a sensor. It's done with what we call GSR. Galvanic skin response, and people know what this is, right? So this is like a lie. This is what's basically used in polygraphs or lie detectors, and it's a subcategory of what we call EDA, electrodermal activity, or electrodermal response, and that's essentially the electrical activity of your skin. So to claim that these sensors can measure well-being is quite a stretch. Because, as anybody knows who works with these sensors, what they measure is the amount of sweat you produce, and which, of course, then changes the electrical skin conductivity. Okay? And what happens is that it doesn't measure the kind of emotion, it measures the intensity of arousal that's generated by an emotion. Okay? So you have to interpolate between that and then saying this person is happy or sad or depressed or whatever. So there's a quite stretch between the actual technology of the sensor and the claim that one is making. Now, this is part of a bigger genre that some of you know called affective computing. One of the kind of core researchers, Rosalind Picard at the MIT Media Lab, has started several of these companies to develop this kind of proprietary technology. And this is, of course, computing that relates to and deliberately influences emotions or other affective phenomena. Okay, so this, of course, is a research area that encompasses a whole range of things, from speech recognition to bodily analyzing gestures, but they're all essentially dependent on very similar kinds of technologies. Okay. But this is a very disputed field. It's not only disputed among engineers and computer scientists, but it's also disputed, of course, among cultural critics who question the ability of any technology to gain objective knowledge about something as complex as our emotions. And that's why I go back to the 19th century, because there was an assumption at the time that by measuring something, you could actually know it. Okay? Now, think for a minute about, that's the typical GSR, that you wear on your fingertips. And then, of course, that's the curve of skin conductive response. It changes according to your arousal. Okay. Now, this is interesting because this paradigm keeps going back, as I think Simon will relate very much, which he's already said, to this obsession with a kind of visualization of your data, right? So everything that goes back to a very old Platonic idea: to see something is to know it, right? Sight is knowledge. No other sense really can deliver knowledge except for vision. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this kind of like oculorocracy, as some people call it. And some devices do work with things like vibration and sound and aroma. But there's another thing that's interesting in these devices, and this is what I can conclude, which is this idea that they try to scientize our emotions through this concept of measurement, while at the same time claiming that they're totally new, right? This is a whole new world that's emerging because now these devices can be aligned with science. Now, this is interesting. This is Amazon's new attempt at, this is a part of a patent, of course. It's not yet there, although at least we may not know it's not there. They're working on the development of wearable mood sensing technologies in which software can detect different vocal patterns to discern between emotional states such as joy, anger, sorrow, sadness, fear, disgust, boredom, or stress. So, for instance, like, Alexa, cough, I'm hungry. Would you like a recipe for chicken soup? No, thanks. Oh, I can find you something else. By the way, would you like some cough drops, which would be delivered in 1 hour from now? That would be awesome. Thanks for asking. No problem. I'll email you an order confirmation. Feel better. So be careful if you say or you cough around Alexa, because Alexa may determine that that cough will order you a supply of cough drops or something even stronger. Now, how is that possible, again, going from your voice to ordering cough drops? Well, technically, you can look at the voice input. You can determine that that user has an abnormal physical condition. You can determine the audio content. This is all based on, of course, informational retrieval technologies in terms of speech recognition and detecting of things like formants and all the kinds of different qualities that are in the voice. And then that audio content is presented. And now that you can see more complicated, you can receive the sound input, convert the analog signal, and all of this. So, this is all happening at the level of invisibility, for us. This is another device, the PIP, the PIP. This PIP device is an innovative handheld device that promotes mindfulness. Okay, so this is the next step. Not only can we measure emotions, but now, of course, the device can also promote mindfulness, something which, of course, over different types of meditative traditions over thousands of years is very difficult to achieve, but this device can, of course, enable it within seconds. So this is also, of course, powered by science. So this is very interesting, the idea that mindfulness is powered by science. So there's a lot of contradiction if you read this text. That promotes groundbreaking piece of tech needed and impactful brand presence to create both. So, so you have brand presence and mindfulness and credibility and global audiences and a new revolution in well-being and stress management. So, and this is, of course, and that's that device, of course, right? So we need to simplify the complexity around the PIP and create one compelling message that readily connects with people and so on and so forth. Okay, so let me just finish up. This is another device, Spire. So now you also see that not only emotion, but also stress is the thing that also can be relieved by all these technologies. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that in the past, many of these kinds of ways of measuring emotion were tied to a long lineage of practices. So bio or neurofeedback, which starts in the 1960s, EST, which is Erhard seminar training, which of course was a kind of emotional thing where you would kind of give up your a kind of self-therapy, and then of course like things like life logging. And what's interesting to see is that this is the vision of this company that makes the field device. You can see the way that human emotion, which is human connection, which is traditional psychotherapy, is increasingly on this curve being replaced by digital therapeutics, and finally, by biomarkers for management and evaluation of mental illness. So to finish, what's interesting if we go back to these ideas that we can inscribe our emotions with sensing and with these technologies, well, the next step is essentially to think about those claims that are made and these devices, if you decide to buy one, about really what's going on. Whether or not there is a self there that the technology can reveal, or whether or not that technology is actually producing your understanding of yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. That's a kind of a...
You have a sign on your back.
Reserved by IMPAKT. Well, that's correct.
Really good.
For the next hour
see
or
it's
so.
An inscription of.
Thanks. What you are sketching here is something that seems to help us, that seems to want us to be better persons, but at the same time, everywhere around you, you see red lights like this is not what we should want. How bad is this, do you think? Or is this actually the only way for us to go, like we solve tech problems with more tech?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question, because it's not simply that these technology companies are foisting this stuff on us, it's that we also want it. There's a self-governance that takes place, and this is a famous citation from Foucault, this idea of technologies of self, that we do things to ourselves. And this, of course, is not new. This goes back to the Greeks, to the Stoics, to the Epicureans, who used to make laundry lists of like what they ate in terms of their diets, and to try to figure out how you could actually modulate and change your notion of self. And so monks do that as well. And so there's all sorts of techniques we do to our bodies to try and bring us into other states of being. The interesting thing is that this tension between what operates in terms of techniques and machines, and then this idea of the production of certain kinds of people from these machines, you know, and the claims are one thing, but actually, you know, as real scientists will tell you, measuring emotions is very difficult. I mean, Simon talked about the facial muscles. Yes, Paul Ekman, anthropologist in the 1960s, did a lot of work where he said, yes, there's 7 types of emotion based on facial muscle relationships. So there has been a lot of work in this, and you start to see the research coming out into these commercial devices. But the claims that are being made about know yourself, the same happens, I'm sure Erik will, let's just say about EEG, you know yourself versus actually what is possible from the technologies is a very, very different thing. And so the question really is, what kind of selves do we become as we start to incorporate these technologies into the everyday routines? You know?
And could you also maybe say that, well, 50 years ago we are more expecting good things from technology. We were more curious in an optimistic way, like we were really curious what it's going to bring us, like the internet with all the promises about democracy, about giving voice to minorities, etc. And where we are today, we are, well, maybe sadder and wiser, and trying to be more precautious about everything we are putting ourselves into, or is that too negative?
Well, first of all, I mean, remember the quote that Oppenheimer, the statement Oppenheimer said when the atomic bomb was triggered at Trinity. He said, "I've become death, destroyer of all worlds," which is from the Bhagavad Gita. So I'm not sure we've always had an optimistic vision of technology. The difference now than the 19th century is that those devices were in laboratories, and now we are just walking, we are the laboratories. We are the walking test subjects for these very large corporations, and it's a complicity thing because, of course, we're not going to give up Instagram and Facebook. It's too emotionally wrapped up in us. But at the same time, then we can, of course, these companies can benefit from that kind of complicity and be able to, yes, of course, we give all this to you for free, and it's all free, right? Well, it's actually not free because the data that's
product.
Well, yeah, and we're the product, and also, we're, as Shoshana Zuboff says, now we're not even the consumers of those companies. The clients of those big tech companies, like the FANG companies, are actually the advertisers. We don't buy anything from them. I mean, we buy things from Amazon, but we don't buy anything from Facebook or Google. It's all free, right? So the actual clients of those companies are not us, which is very, very different than industrial production, where the idea that with General Motors and big corporations in the 1950s, 1960s was that we worked on those assembly lines and we bought those cars, or we bought the products that those companies made. But now it's slightly different. This is the argument that Zuboff makes. So.
Nice. Maybe we can later in the panel discussion tie this into a little bit your performance of last night. Because there I was curious about it as well. But we are now out of time.
Great.
And I'm going to introduce the next speaker, the last one. Thank you. Erik Aarnoutse, brain implants. This is not an artist, people, so be aware. This is a real scientist and an engineer, he told me. So Erik Aarnoutse is a neuroscientist even, working on neurotechnology. He studies and develops implantable brain-computer interfaces to help people who are not able to control their muscles to communicate through brain signals. The first participant in his current study is an ALS patient who uses his system every day to communicate at home and outside her home. Aarnoutse is working towards even better hardware and software possibilities to make sure implantable neurotechnology will be of use for an ever-increasing number of patient groups. Erik, thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. So, we're talking about interfaces. Let me first give you an impression how Hollywood sees how interfaces will work in the future.
Biometrics are good.
When 3 is ready.
Keep your arms in.
So this is from Avatar. Jack Scully is paralyzed, but he is able to go into a machine which sort of looks like an MRI
Phase lock 99%.
and
Link is
has
stable.
all the information of the body transmitted to with some delay to an avatar. So this is really a complete interface to the body. And the second movie you may think of is in The Matrix. So this is where the interface is really to get all the information into a virtual environment. So by now you realize that all this information is not the body, but it's really the brain which is interfacing. So, and that actually is a field in neuroscience. I'm a neuroscientist. We call this brain-computer interfacing. And so we neuroscientists study how the brain works, which is very, very difficult. We know a lot about the cells of the brain, the neurons, and we know how they communicate. But for a real interesting interface, you really want to know what the neural code is of this. So that is very important. So this is an animation of how the brain cells communicate. It's by electrical signals, which are represented here in light flashes, which don't actually occur, but it's electrical signals. And that's how we know the brain cells communicate, and we can actually record that. So we are able to record single neurons, the activity from that, and see what they're doing. So if we're recording, I'm talking about the output of the brain. So and most people don't realize that, but the real output of the brain is actually the muscles. So the area in the brain which is involved in movements of the muscles, that's the motor area. That's the real output of the brain. The motor area is here. So so this is my right hand, and everything is crossed in the brain. So this is the information. Here you can see activity if I move my hand. So we build interfaces, or there are interfaces to record these signals, and we know from the motor area, so for most of the brain, we really don't know exactly how that's working, but for the motor area, we know that these neurons are involved in a specific direction. So if I do this, then a specific group of neurons is active. If I go in the other direction, in three-dimensional space, other neurons are active. So we can make use of that information. And we can make use of that to record that and to control something outside our body. So there are about 25 patients in worldwide who have implanted electrodes, a lot of them to record this information to make use of that. So I will show a movie of Jan Schoenemann, who has two of these electrodes, so needle electrodes, to record single neurons in her motor cortex, and she can make use of that to control a robotic arm. And I will show that in this video.
I just have to say verbally, and then it was.
So she's able to reach to the chocolate bar and grasp the red box to hold it. So you see the connectors are external, so she actually has cables out from her brain. And she ate a lot of things in this session, and this is a red pepper. So.
Oh, look at that. Got the whole thing.
Okay, so the next patient I want to show a video of, and of course, scientists try to improve. So this is a patient who has 6 of these small arrays in his brain. And he has it on both sides, so he's able to control 2 arms simultaneously. And here, so he's bold. He's a very nice guy. I met him last week, and he's very proud of having these connectors on his head. So it's both in a virtual environment and an actual robotic arm. The robotic arms are very, very expensive, so they try to do virtual environments first. So thus far I talked about the output, but we also know some of the input. So next to the motor cortex, there's a somatosensory cortex, which is that's the area of the brain which is involved in all touch-like senses. So touch, temperature, pressure, these kind of information. And with the same arrays, we can actually bring electricity, so we bring an electric current to the cells and then they start being active. And that actually creates the sensation of a kind of touch. So this is the Nathan Copeland, who I also spoke last week. And he was the first patient to have an electrode array in the somatosensory cortex on his hand area. And they put some sensors on the robotic arm, and he is able to blindfolded, so that's interesting for Simon. So blindfolded, he is able to tell which finger is touched, so that the sensor makes that a current is put on the, especially on the exactly on the place where the information is processed for this particular finger.
Index, ring, pinky, index, middle,
I'm trying to trick him, but he answers correctly. So
ring.
So all these patients are all these patients are spinal cord injury patients who volunteered to do that. Nathan Copeland is actually the guy who fist bumped Obama, so that's interesting. With his robotic arm, see? So, and he actually does this as well. So, the interesting thing about this is that he kind of feels that he is fist bumping Obama, but he doesn't do that. So the robot arm is doing that. So the fact that he feels that he fist bumped Obama tells you that if you have control over this robot arm, you have some sense of agency over this robot arm, it becomes a kind of part of your body. And that sensation is very strong. So participants in this kind of study report this. So thus far it's about arms. So people are actually working, this came out a couple of weeks ago. It's a French study where they have a complete body representation, and this is a patient who is able to, so also a spinal cord injury, and he's able to move his arms and move his legs based on brain control. So recording cells and translating that, decoding that into a message to the exoskeleton, which replaces the muscles in this case. So this looks very fancy, but you may have noticed that this is really only working in the laboratory. The Nathan Copeland told me he really wants to have something at home without a PhD walking behind him to push the buttons and control everything and reset everything, calibrate, etc. So the group where I'm working in has actually done that. So we have brought this technology at home, but in a very simple way, simply because it has to be very small, and that is not possible with all the possibilities you can do in a laboratory. Let me introduce you Hanneke de Bruyne. So she's a participant in our study. The first one, she was brave enough to let her implanted an electrode on the motor cortex this time. It's a larger electrode, so it records about 500,000 neurons simultaneously, which gives a very robust signal, but it's only one dimension. What she can do is really a one-dimensional signal. So she is completely paralyzed. She can move the corner of her mouth a little bit. That's how she can answer yes/no questions. She has some eye control, but very slow. And so this is the kind of people, so it's called locked-in syndrome. So these people are really locked in. They have huge difficulties for communication. So this is the kind of people who can benefit the most from this kind of technology. And so she will explain to you how it feels to be locked in.
Als ik mijn leven een cijfer geef, is het een 7. Ik moet veel missen, maar er is ook nog heel veel te genieten. Ik heb nooit spijt gehad van mijn keuze voor beademing.
So what you learn is that despite people think this is a horrible situation, she has a pretty good quality of life. So she wants to do that. And the other thing is that it's an ALS. She has ALS, which means that all muscles, all muscle control is lost. Also for the breathing muscles. So to continue living, she needed mechanical ventilation. So that's why she decided to do that. So we implanted small electrodes on the surface of the brain, and there's a wire underneath the skin towards the chest area where an implanted amplifier is there, and that transmits the signal outside of the body wirelessly, so there's no infection danger. And then she can actually use that to, the signal goes to the computer, which has decoding software and spelling software, and she's able to give a yes/no response or a select response by attempting to do this. She can't do that, obviously, but her motor cortex is still active, so we can pick that up. And that's how she can actually spell. It's very slow, but it's very important that she has this possibility. You can do that without computers and brain-computer interfaces. If someone is looking at you and telling all the letters of the alphabet, and then if the alphabet is there, she can respond with this corner of the mouth. But this is really an independent way. She doesn't have to wait until someone is looking at her. We asked her to spell droom, so dream in English. I'm gonna wait a little. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to show you 1 minute of this video to see the speed of this, but actually she's able to spell. So she missed the first one, but now she is able to select the D. I hope you can see it. Yeah, it's visible. And then the next step is to select the R. So first, this is in 3 steps. So she does this and to select. And so communicating with her is you have to adjust to the speed where she can respond. But or you give questions with yes, no, where only yes and no is the answer, so she can quickly respond with her corner of the mouth. So I think my time is up, but believe me, she is able to spell this. So the last thing I wanted to show, so she gave an interview with this device by email, because she can email with this, to NRC a few weeks ago. And she gave this as an answer, how she feels to use that. So with the letter card, I can't ask attention. With the UMP, I can. So UMP is our system. So this is for me a feeling of safety. It's the only way to communicate without help from others. Spelling with UMP is slow, but it works. I'm already very dependent on people around me. The UMP gives me some control in my own hands. And if one can't do much anymore, that's very valuable. UMP also takes away some of the burden for the people around me. So when she gave this answer to NRC newspaper, we were very, very happy and very proud that we really gave her this opportunity to use that. She uses it every day. She's very happy with it. It works inside the house, outside, and she's using it all the time. Thank you.
Wow, this is amazing. I have so many questions.
Okay.
Mainly because I don't understand how, what is the magnitude of this research? How many years have you been working on this already? With how many people? How big is your team?
So our team is quite small. It's about 6-7 people. It depends. PhD students come and go. We have researched this with epilepsy patients who have implanted electrodes for diagnosis. And so that took several years, about 6-7 years to figure out that we were able to do this. And then, so she's implanted 4 years ago, and she's using the system 3.5 years now at home. And we have implanted the second one, and we will implant a third participant in a few months.
And how much risk is there for these kind of implantations? I mean, there must have been a first time that you are not really know what you're doing.
Of course, we know what we're doing. We spent 2 years investigating safety of these devices. This device is developed not for our purposes, but for a deep brain stimulation, which is a common procedure for Parkinson patients. And so the risk is comparable with the risk for surgery for Parkinson patients.
And we already discussed this a little bit, if how to collaborate beyond your own field, not just with scientists and engineers, but if you start talking to artists or philosophers maybe, do you see in your research any openness or possibilities of connecting these kind of technologies to people who don't have disabilities? Could it be used in, like you started out with some science fiction movies?
Yes and no. So we will never reach the amount of information with the Matrix has or Avatar has. But it's certainly possible to envision that we can use this technology to add something to enhance human possibilities. The most common thought is, what if you have 3 hands instead of 2? Wouldn't that help? So we think that we can probably train people to do that. If the ethical committee will give permission to do that, we don't know. But so yes, so for little things that is possible. The brain is very flexible. You can train a lot, so some enhancement is possible, I think.
Okay, I think there are still a lot of interesting connections to be made. Maybe in the panel we can get there. Thank you, Erik, for this interesting presentation. And I want to invite every one of the speakers here on stage. Then we have another 20 minutes. So maybe I start with the first question, and then you can already warm up for your questions, because we have this throw mic, and it will come in your direction pretty soon. But maybe just to follow up on the last presentation, is there for the designer and the artist in the panel, are there any thoughts here on how you would like to connect something like this to your artistic practices? Do you see any, could you make art from this? Or do we need to make more designs for this?
See if Simon can answer first.
Oh, it was to me.
Well, it's to all of you, but you
artist
can
on
take
the
the
panel.
first
Okay.
step
Sorry,
up
can
to it.
you repeat the question? Because I thought it was the audience. But can you repeat it?
Yes, of course. I was wondering if you see any possibilities for you as a designer with the technologies Erik is working with. How you would like to work with this or collaborate or?
Yeah, surely. Like to say, I'm impressed by the two speakers. I think they're in a whole deeper world than I am. And just to say, the last speaker is way, like I am, way more on a superficial way of. I'm basically not translating, but I'm diverting the senses. But yeah, it's certainly interesting to think deeper or about the subject. Yes, I wouldn't have a clear answer, but my answer would be yes.
Thank you.
Make it short.
And Chris, are you?
I mean, as Erik was saying, you know, there's a big difference between medical grade implantation in a laboratory where you can achieve this level of accuracy and precision, which you need in the sciences to measure those things, and you know, people buying, artists using cheap 3-electrode brain computer interfaces that, you know, give you alpha, theta, gamma, delta, gamma waves that we don't, even neuroscientists don't really know what those things are, and how the problem is the relation between the so-called neural correlates, you know, to subjective experience, and then, you know, what happens in the brain, and that's of course a fascinating area. But what's really interesting in your work, which is demonstrated, is that you know, the brain is not a bunch of symbols. You know, it's not. You know, it's a sensory motor system that you're talking about, right? And of course, there are symbolic processes that happen in the brain, but ultimately, you know, there's input and there's action. You know, there's action in the world, and it's not just basically the brain exists as in a vat. You know, it's tied to a body. You know, and that's very important to see from scientists. You know, because there's still the belief in computing, for instance, that, you know, computers are brains, but they're not. You know, they're absolutely not, because computers are symbolic systems. They're not sensory motor systems. So that's the interesting thing, where the overlap happens in the arts, design, but also in the humanities, in the social sciences.
Okay. Is there a question somewhere from the audience?
Now, there you are.
That's a very good design.
Okay. Hi, thank you for your talks. I have a question to Simon. I was intrigued by you talking about diverting the senses, and then of course the skin as an alternative to the sight is an obvious choice. But I was wondering, is in that research, are you also thinking about other senses to replace sight than the skin?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Like, I would say the skin is just one solution. Basically, you divert, you change the senses. But I would assume that the last speaker is able to talk way more about that. But you can also use the outer brain to replace the visual senses, because when you, first of all, I'm not schooled in this, but let's say that you add electronic stimuli to the back of the brain, where's the occipital brain tissue, and that is the center where the eye nerve is attached to. So if you put electrode stimuli on that skin, you would actually see a star. You would actually see, like when you are hit by something hard, and you or fall on the ground or whatever. I would say Erik is the best to explain that more sharp.
People are actually working on a visual prosthesis directly connected to the visual cortex. So that's actually that's behind the behind part of the brain. That, apart from very small experiments, is not done on a big scale, but people are actually working on that. But so for diverting the senses, it actually is interesting to make the choice between touch and auditory information. So touch is, you can represent a three-dimensional space with touch. With audio, it's harder, but it's possible as well. So it really depends on what kind of information you want to send to your brain. Which of the two choices are there? Maybe you can combine that. But so it's the number of dimensions you want to convey into the brain, which makes what kind of other sense you would put in there.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, from my perspective, so I am not particularly trying to find a solution for not seeing, but I try to make actually a product more on a sociological field that allows you to grasp well, just let's say the moods, and to have, which I don't really mean serious, but is to grasp the emotions and feelings of others. And I think that is the dementia perhaps you're talking about, that I wouldn't find really quickly a solution for that in another, preferably in another way, but not through the brain cortex. So that, because that is complex. So I wouldn't say that would be a straight solution.
Thank you. Is there maybe another question? I see all the way up there. Good luck.
Hi, this question is for Chris. At the end of your talk, you were talking about the technologies of the self, and you made this difference between how this has been going on since the Epicureans and how this way of technologizing the self is different. And then in there I saw some idea of how these technologies performatively create a normative sense of the self. And then I would like to know if you agree with this, and what kind of differences do you see between these technologies of the self and any other kind of monitoring of the self that could happen before or even now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, absolutely, these are normative technologies. First of all, because the output of these technologies, the visualization, I mean, these are statistical processes, right? They're these signals, in order for them to make any kind of sense, to tell you something useful, they have to be, they have to be taken through statistical processes, just like machine learning processes are, that's a statistical learning systems, right? So statistics are about groups of numbers and like looking for where norms are and where outliers are. And outliers are, push the outliers over there because you want to see where things are actually connected to each other, or where they're statistically relevant to each other. So there is certainly a kind of normative process going on here, because it's like, oh, okay, you want to be in this group versus that group, and so there's a quote from Fitbit, don't compare yourself to others, compare yourself to yesterday, compare yourself to yourself, so you can look at different benchmarks. But the interesting thing is that people believe these technologies as truth producers. That's the question, right? And in fact, statistics are not truth producers, they're techniques to understand groupings of phenomena, And so Galton, the inventor of eugenics and also of regression techniques in the end of the 19th century, when he was trying to understand why different generations of seeds or parents or children, like why they change per generation, he realized, is that a hereditary thing or is that a statistical property? So there is a link between the rise of statistical thinking and the rise of norms, for sure. And then, of course, many people from Ian Hacking to Foucault to others have talked about that quantification thing. So, but the interesting thing is that people believe that the sensors, and these are commercial sensors. Of course, they're robust because they have to hold up under millions of people buying them. But they think that they don't lie, And that's the interesting thing is that a medical grade EEG is one thing versus a cheap headset, So this jump between a electromechanical device and something as, let's say, and subjective experience is a big gulf, So the normative discussion is very critical to notions of self anyway, but particularly in these techniques.
So the idea that so statistics makes that everyone thinks with a normal distribution, so the Gauss curve, and if you have more and more information about yourself, you probably try to be somewhere in the middle of the Gauss curve, Gaussian curve, where everyone else is. The interesting thing about society is that the people who are on the edges of the curves are probably the most interesting ones. So,
and they're the ones that are not seen as abnormal, right, or not normal, right? So
exactly.
So that's very interesting because from that mathematical principle, you get actually some construction of what kind of society you're in,
Any more questions?
I mean, I was going to say something quickly about the performances to Erik, didn't see it, but so in this performance last night, we were using a spiking neural network to drive a reaction time experiment. Okay. And the interesting thing about the spiking neuron, I mean, that mathematical model is they're very, very different than, artificial neural networks that are being used now, for image recognition and things, because of their temporal dimension. And you pointed this out, is that, okay, it's billions of or 10 to 11 neurons that the information is carried in terms of frequency and rate in terms of essentially the signals from sensory receptors to the brain. So it's very interesting when you start to think about how do you encode such complex information into essentially these electrical signals. And those mathematical models leave out all the chemical parts of it as well. So.
Yeah, so this is an oversimplification to tell you that neurons communicate with electricity and that's all there is. There are many more ways where neurons can communicate, but this is the most accessible one because you can put an electrode in there. So it's what is called a firing rate, so the number of these impulses per second, which is probably the most interesting, the most informative one as we know now. But we also know that the timing of these spikes, these impulses, is very important as well. Yeah. And we really, really don't understand that part yet.
Yeah, so this the intervallic relationship between the different spikes, it sounds very, very interesting.
So firing rate can go up, but also the firing rate can stay at the same level, but then the timing is different, and that can introduce more information, and we really, really don't have any clue how we have to interpret that. So,
are there more questions? Well, I have a couple of them left.
You have 5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes, okay. I was wondering, since each of you are really operating in a very different industry, in a very different financial system as well, and maybe for you, Simon, your product, where it's now and where you would like it to be, what do you need for this? What steps do you need to take to bring this to a broader audience? Or do you need more testing? Or do you need more visibility? Or do you need more people to work on it? Or do you need more money? What's the next steps for you that you're struggling with or looking forward to?
So we anticipate it to, let's say, work in 2 to 3 years. But then the question is, how do you bring that to the market? So that's another field, which is not my league. And I think the interesting thing that we're doing now is that we are looking at mainly how it works. So how to, are you able to learn it through the skin, these kind of things. And just from a designer's point of view, where do you, what kind of wearable do you make, or do you, and how does that wearable looks like? So that, from my point of view as a designer, that's interesting because then you can start to think how to implement it into a wearable, which is not only a bracelet, but could be anything. You've got just for that information to be diverted through the skin. You've got a whole body full of skin, so that is handy. And I think for me the most interesting thing is to actually look at if it's possible that you are able to learn it, that you're able to implement it in your social life, just as to use it, that it's that it's beneficiary to the quality of communication. And actually, I think that at a certain point, I will either pass it through or, because the following to bring it to the market or anything, I don't really even think about that. So for me, the interesting thing is the design process and the research process.
Yeah, so you need another party to take a next step.
Sure, yeah. Eventually, so depending also on the outcome, I haven't specified an outcome as that I want the product to work, because I'm not sure yet. And but if it is working, then there will be another party that needs to take over.
Clear. And for you, Erik, what will it take to take parts of your research out of the research phase, out of the lab, and into, well, daily lives? Can you give us a number? 10 years, or don't wait for it?
It depends what you want. So the system we have with the ALS patient is already taken into the home of the patient. To make that a company is it might be possible. But we need, so the hardware we use is not developed by us. So we need the company for that. We have a decoding software and the interface software, so that's doable. In our case, by far the largest problem is that we want to implant electronics in a body, which there's huge regulatory regulations about that. So it took us 2 years to get approval to even do this. So any company has has to invest millions and millions to get this into the market. And the target group, with what we can do now, is very, very small. So the robot arm part is, the user group is much larger. I think many people would be interested in that. But I know how much these robot arms cost. So the most advanced robot arm in the world is used by one patient who is an amputee and uses that attached to his part of his arm which is still functioning. That one is that the investments of that is $250 million. So there's no way a company can afford to bring that to the market. So that is the problem. These are the problems we have. So decoding software, that can be a small company.
So simultaneously, we better look into the matrix possibilities to make people believe that they are capable of doing things they're actually not capable of, while you're working on making technology more accessible. Good. I'm afraid we're out of time. Yes, a stop sign. Thank you very much for your contributions. It was really fascinating, and